I can say with certainty that is the last time my name is going to be on the same marquee.
So apparently MSNBC has organized some ceremony celebrating the top court intellectuals of the modern state.
That's your names. Also not a Nobel Prize winner, just in case. That's me. So this is called 7 Days of Genius. And when the word genius was mentioned, I was backstage with all of you guys, and there was a lot of eye rolling and chuckling. But like it or not, you are considered geniuses, so take it. I want to start with a broad question, because you are considered geniuses of the field in the field of economics. This is sort of a philosophical question as much as it is anything else. You're considered geniuses, but when we talk about the most disruptive thing that happened, economically speaking, globally, we talk about the years 2007 and 2008. And yet many economists failed to predict that disruptive moment in the United States and globally.
But both Paul and I did.
Yes, I'm talking, and that's why you're the geniuses. And I guess, and to that point, I wonder if you think the field of economics, on whole, is better at reinterpreting the events of the past than it is looking towards the future. I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I didn't predict it. I mean, I thought something bad would happen, but nothing remotely on this scale, right? So the housing bubble, thought it would be ugly, but the scale of the ugliness came as a shock to me, as to almost everyone. But I actually think, let me say that the crisis itself, the financial crisis, we didn't, hardly, some people saw it coming, but they also saw 5 crises that didn't happen coming, so it doesn't quite count. But in a way, that is to some extent
like Peter Schiff,
excusable, because
notorious for constantly predicting recessions.
the world is a complicated place. There's always going to be something out there that you missed, and that's typically where really drastic events come from.
It's not really a measure of an economist's ability, in my opinion, if they're good at predicting recessions or not. That's not really the role of an economist, to predict a recession, but rather to understand what's going on, to explain what happened, to know why the recession occurred is much more valuable than predicting recession.
Not much known is that actually
anybody can make a prediction, make an explanation about the business cycle. That's something that's valuable to society that we can work with.
Since those crisis days, a lot of basic economics has worked remarkably well. I mean, I didn't see the crisis coming, but I and many others said, look, all these people telling you that the Fed's printing money is going to cause runaway inflation, that interest rates are going to soar because of those budget deficits. Not so. Look at the situation we're in. It's not going to work. And in fact, it's worked beautifully. One of the things I sometimes say is I've spent my life not entirely sure whether I was a fraud or not. Because, I knew I was good at publishing papers.
I've spent my entire life also not entirely sure if you are a fraud or not, Krugman.
He's in on that one.
No, but that was interesting. I was only in the last 6 or so years that I say, oh, hey, the stuff works. We've been actually pretty good on a lot of these issues these past years. So that's actually, now the sad thing is that half the economics profession has thrown away things that we know work, largely for ideological reasons. So the real sin, from my point of view, is not the failure to predict the crisis, it's the insistence on clinging to doctrines that are just obviously not working for the 6 years that have followed the crisis.
Professor Stigliz?
Well, I think in terms of that, I think one of the things is that I think the economy's recovery has not been particularly good, and that I think it was pretty clear that you could not just rely on monetary policy.
Right.
That it helped a little bit. I think
you shouldn't rely on monetary or fiscal policy. The whole point is that the recession is the healthy phase of the business cycle. The government doesn't have to do anything in order for the economy to fix itself. And the more that they intervene and try to prevent the economy from righting itself, the worse things are going to get. The whole reason why the 2008 bubble happened in the first place is because after the dot-com crash, the Federal Reserve tried to use monetary policy to fix the problem of that crash, and that's what created the housing bubble in the first place.
Paul was right that the fears that all that increase printing of money, whatever you call it, would be inflationary, were absurd, and that's been proven right.
Printing money is inflation. That's what it is. Now, inflation can manifest itself as a price level increase, but you can still have inflation even if prices were to stay level, or even if you have just a very modest increase, because naturally you have deflation as society becomes more productive, as the supply of available goods grows versus the demand to purchase them versus the quantity demanded, then prices naturally fall. And we saw this during the 19th century in the Gilded Age. Prices were falling about 2.5% per annum. So prices naturally fall, but because we always have inflation, we're used to prices actually going up. So the inflation not only inflates at the 3 to 4% or whatever that CPI figures, rigged though they may be, tell us, but in fact at an additional 1 or 2%, nobody knows the precise number, which is that prices would have fallen if we had kept the money supply stable. And then the other thing is that America exports its currency around the world, so the inflation isn't necessarily going to show up like it would if the dollar wasn't the reserve currency, if it wasn't in such high demand as an investment medium outside of the country.
But also true that.
But even when you have low inflation or even a stable price level, that doesn't mean things are okay, because there's still economic dislocation going on behind the scenes. During the 1920s, the policy of the Federal Reserve was that of a stable price level. This has been the goal of central banks for a long time now. And even if you manage to achieve a stable price level, there's still, if you have bank credit expansion going on within the system, you're still getting malinvestments. You're still distorting the interest signal and encouraging malinvestments in capital goods industries, and you're setting the seeds for the next economic downturn. So it's not that capitalism is inherently unstable in and of itself. It's not that recessions or depressions just happen. They're caused by bank credit expansion, by the whole system of central banking, and by these efforts on the part of these so-called geniuses to fix the problems that they created themselves, and their solutions just keep making things worse.
That there were economists who thought that monetary policy would do the trick.
Right.
And who thought that, the way I put it, that putting the banks in the hospital for a year and a half, giving them not a blood transfusion, but a couple $1 trillion of money, would make them feel happier, and that would get the economy working again. It's clear that that was wrong, that you needed real fiscal policy, you needed real stimulus, and that
No, you don't need stimulus. Government spending is bad for the economy. This whole notion of velocity of money and have the government spend when the economy is down, to stimulate things, to get things going, is just utter nonsense. What happens in the economy is you're trading production for production. It doesn't matter how fast the money's circulating. That doesn't change how much has been produced. The amount of wealth created by an economy is the amount of wealth that is produced. And when the government spends money, nothing new is being created. All they're doing is redistributing wealth. They're changing who gets that wealth that was produced, because the government spends the money, but then they collect the money in taxes. So instead of person A, who created the money, created the wealth, be it a worker or a businessman or both, receiving the just fruits from their labors, you get person B, member of the political class. They receive the money, and they get to spend it on their own consumption, their own standard of living. So this policy is redistributive, but it doesn't create any more wealth. In fact, it usually leads to less wealth being created, since that money is spent on consumption, on the living standard of the members of the political class, instead of being reinvested into the economy, as often it would be by members of the economic class. Of course, the members of the economic class could also choose to have a higher standard of living, which is obviously their choice, and that's fine too. I suppose it's also possible the member of the political class could reinvest the money, to be fair.
Fundamental sense, the economy was broken before the crisis. It was using a bubble to keep it going. And that's what we should have recognized, and was not, by most members of the economics profession and by the administration.
Not to mention, there were other policies in play here, like federal regulations that were insisting that minorities get loans that they couldn't afford. So there were some interventions by the government that exacerbated the situation.
Let me first apologize that my English sounds a lot like French, and let me also mention that it's 2 a.m. in Paris, and so if I seem a bit slow, there are reasons for this. But I think there's a lot of ideology in the economic profession, and I think many economists have a view of markets which is not only idealistic and naive, but they are defending the view that markets are working efficiently, are working well for ideological reasons. Also, I think economists spend a lot of time, sometimes.
Yes, and there's a lot of intellectuals who have the view of government that is idealistic and not very realistic.
Doing complicated mathematical models, trying to pretend that markets are efficient. But they do that also to try to impress others in other disciplines, to look more scientific. I am not sure.
I mean, I'm with you on the fact that economists use economic models, that complicated mathematical models that have very little relationship to the real world. That's 100% true.
This is not a joke.
I am not sure this is, I'm not sure this is working, but this is certainly part of their strategy. So, I think we should be very modest. I view myself more as a social scientist than as an economist. I think the frontiers between economics, history, sociology are not as clear as what economists try to pretend. Economists try to pretend that sometimes they have developed a science that is so sophisticated that the rest of the...
Mises viewed both economics and history as subsets of praxeology, the science of human action.
The world cannot understand, but I think this is a joke. I think the reason I was attracted in this field is because I think we start from very low, from very little, so at least there is room to make progress, but we have to recognize that we all we can do. I don't believe in genius. I think our only advantage as compared to other people is that we are paid to collect data and to try to understand the theoretical mechanism or models that can account for this data. And we have to be modest and try to make this little progress if we want to be useful. And it's not always clear that economists are so useful.
We put too much stock in economists, perhaps. But let me ask you, as someone who's observing society holistically, perhaps not discretely mathematically, in terms of your social scientist cap, Europe, and I'll ask you guys this vis-a-vis America, where do you see Europe in 20 years, given the sort of upheaval that the EU is facing at this moment?
Okay, well, that's a difficult question. Right now the situation in Europe, and particularly in the Eurozone, is very bad. So the main problem with inequality today in Europe is really unemployment, youth unemployment. So the level of youth
unemployment I don't really care.
In Europe, but also in France, it's extremely large. So when you have 20%, sometimes 25, 30%.
Well, this is funny.
Who start their life with no professional experience. This is a terrible situation. And I think that the basic problem is that the
discourse.
Well, and that gets us to another sort of other mitigating factors here. I mean, the reason there's a sort of misguided focus on the debt has to do with one of the political parties being obsessively focused on that. It has to do with a media structure that talks about that incessantly. It has to do with folks that just want to hear what they want to hear in one sector. And I guess I wonder, as we look...
It's simple. Debt is bad because government spending is bad.
Onto the 21st century landscape where facts have become fungible. As economists, how distressing is that to you? I mean, there are true debates about things we thought were settled.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it really, it really is much. This is one of the questions. Wasn't it always thus? And I think it wasn't. It used to be that there was an establishment and it would sort of settle on what a fact was, and sometimes wrongly, but at least there was, and it was persuadable because it was not that polarized. And now, sure, people know what they know, and they have. It's a funny thing because the availability of information is greater than ever before. It's possible if you want to learn about a subject and are willing to put in some effort and have a little bit of a trying to find out a way to if you have just a bit of a bullshit detector, you can screen things out and but on the other hand, the ability to live in a cocoon of false stuff. I mean, we actually have been following, some people I know have been following on healthcare. If you look at the Affordable Care Act and how it's played out, if you have been watching Fox, every problem or rumor of a problem gets reported, and then when it goes away or it turns out it wasn't true, that never gets reported. So you have the feeling that this thing is a disaster. In fact, what we probably have done at this point is we probably insured about 20 million people once the second year's done.
Well, yeah, you got a whole bunch more people insured. You made healthcare insurance compulsory. Of course, people are going to buy insurance if you force them to buy insurance. That doesn't mean what you're doing is a good idea. Okay, so healthcare insurance becomes mandatory. Well, now you no longer have a free market, because consumers are captured. They literally have to buy the product. So there's no incentive to keep price down. So insurance companies can keep raising their prices. Same with hospitals and doctors. So what's the solution to that? Well, then the government's going to say, well, we need to step in and regulate price, right? These guys are charging too much. We forced you to buy their product, so you have to pay. So now you've by imposing this mandate, you've also imposed price controls. So you've completely eliminated the market mechanism. You don't have a market. You just have the government dictating what's going to happen. You have socialism. In America, total national expenditure on healthcare has gone from $4 billion in 1970 to $4.25 trillion in 2021. Why? Because of government intervention, government spending on Medicaid and Medicare, and over-regulation of the industry. Everything is driving the cost up and leading to all these problems that interventionists use to justify further intervention. It's a cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of the aspects of Obamacare was the MOR, or medical loss ratio. This was an effort to prevent insurance companies from charging too much. Again, you've made their product mandatory. They can charge whatever they want. They're going to soak the consumer. So the idea was that they had to spend 85% of their revenue on claims. So what happened was insurance companies started acquiring pharmacies and pharmacy benefit managers, and they would start paying through the nose for products like drugs, massive markup. So they're meeting their burden under the law of 85% being paid out, but they're paying it to themselves, and they're collecting the money at a huge markup just in another area of the conglomerate. So that's sort of the inevitable consequence of these massive government programs where you don't have a market, where the government's footing the bill. So everything, the price goes up, and at the end of the day, somebody's picking up the tab, and that's the American public. The best solution is to just have a free market in healthcare and not worry about all these regulations and subsidies and nonsense like that. And it would be a lot better.
Well below it. So it's actually this great policy success, and half the country thinks it's been a disastrous failure.
Do the French just have better bullshit detectors? I mean, when you hear this,
What?
I'll tell you what the French do have: 52% of GDP in government spending. That's what they have, and that's not a recipe for long-term economic growth.
You know, let me give you an outside viewpoint on inequality in the US. You know, I think I find it from the outside. You know, it's very difficult to understand why a plan like the one President Obama described a few weeks ago is apparently will never be adopted in the US. You know, the view that you should ask a little more to the top groups that have done so well in recent decades in order to invest in the public education system, and in particular for all those groups in the population who of course don't go to Harvard or to Princeton, and who are accessing a quality of higher education in community college in this country which is not, let's say, as good as it should be. And if you compare how much is invested.
But the problem with public education isn't the amount of money that's spent. You can throw as much money as you want down that black hole, and you're not going to produce superior results because you've got a socialist monopoly. What you need is market competition. So long as you have this government monopoly where there's no competition, you're just going to have higher costs, more administrative costs, more people being hired in administrative positions, and you're going to get inferior results. What we need is a radically decentralized educational system. You know, you could have a teacher, like the old Little Red schoolhouses. You know, a teacher with like 4 kids, some computers, Khan Academy. They're good to go. That whole system's going to cost you pennies on the dollar compared to the public education system, and I bet it would produce superior results. So there's a lot of different reforms that can be made to education, but so long as you insist on this monolithic, centralized model that's inefficient, that's a government monopoly, you're not going to get those results. But the real purpose behind public education isn't to educate our children in the first place. It's so that they're indoctrinated for 12 years or more in statist dogma. They're taught obedience and conformity are the most important values. They're forced to sit in a chair, and obey the teacher, listen to them drone on. There's very little incentive for teachers to try to do anything outside of the norm to help their students, and they have to be very careful to not make any waves so that they can get their seniority and get those juicy government benefits. And I mean, you can keep raising taxes on the rich as much as you want. That's not going to improve the public school system.
There are statistics that are really striking in this country, and which are very difficult to understand from the viewpoint of the rest of the world. Another example, apart from investment in education, you take the level of the minimum wage in this country is less than what it was in the late 1960s, 50 years ago. So now it's $7.3 or $4 at the federal level per hour. It was $10 if you put it in dollars of today in the late 1960s. So that's quite unusual, in half a century,
Right.
that a country has a lower minimum wage than what it used to have. Unemployment.
Well, for one thing, that's the federal minimum wage. A lot of states have state minimum wages, but it's irrelevant because the real minimum wage should be zero. There's no benefit to the minimum wage. All you're doing is pricing low-skilled workers out of a marketplace. If this guy's such a genius, he should understand how price controls in a market economy work.
At that
Unusual
time,
is euphemistic.
unemployment at that time was actually the same as today, or less than what it is today. So there was no more unemployment. So, and that's
That's probably true, but not necessarily the reason. First of all, unemployment statistics don't even measure unemployment. They measure people who are searching for work. So what about the people who realized they were priced out of the marketplace a long time ago and gave up? They're just existing on government benefits. They're not going to be counted in your statistics. If you really want to measure the impact of the minimum wage, you should be looking at teenage unemployment, because teenagers are a surrogate for low-skilled workers. You raise the minimum wage, it's not going to price out any neurosurgeons or engineers. So telling us that doesn't happen isn't useful information. But if you look at teenage unemployment, which has skyrocketed after the introduction of the minimum wage, especially black teenage unemployment, you see the effect very clearly.
when you look at it from the rest of the world, that's difficult to understand. So I don't know. In Europe, the problems that people are trying to solve are in a way more complicated, because making all nation states disappear in a peaceful manner and create a new, bigger political community, that's a complicated exercise, which it's not working well, but that's a complicated exercise. I mean, here in principle, the federal institutions exist, but they don't seem to be responding.
They don't seem to be functioning.
That's how America was founded. It was, the whole intent was to have a decentralized, the powers of the federal government were strictly enumerated. Everything else was left to the states and to the people. So that was the whole point, which is why America became the richest country in the world, with a GDP that exceeds the entire GDP of your continent, by the way. So if you want to talk about which is the superior economic model, or political structure, I'm going to go with the decentralized American system.
They don't seem to be functioning, and so I've not understood everything as to why the majority rule had become a super majority rule, and I think the rest of the world is not understanding what's happening here in this country. But
you bring up a very good point about the minimum wage, and Walmart just raised its workers' wages. They're going to go up
Never should have saved those guys from the Nazis.
to $10 an hour at some point in the near future. And I wonder, when you guys hear about that, where states taking the initiative to raise the minimum wage, is that the new model? Are we sort of done? Are we Could we be done with the federal minimum wage?
Well, no, I mean, first, when we say one of the things that Walmart raising their wage to that level,
Gee, this Joseph Stigliz guy seems like a smart fellow. Let's see if he said anything about the minimum wage. This is from his textbook, Economics. The second error is to forget that as powerful as governments may be, they can no more repeal the law of supply and demand than they can repeal the law of gravity. When they interfere with its workings, the forces of supply and demand will remain out of balance, with either excess supply or excess demand. Surpluses and shortages create problems of their own. Indeed, if shortages develop, individuals may find that instead of paying the high prices that triggered the government intervention, they cannot obtain the desired goods at any price. Rent control laws are price ceilings, and minimum wage laws are price floors.
Illustrates is the fact that it's not just market forces that are determining wages, that they had the power, the choice to raise their wages. And so, in a way, it strengthens the argument that I've had, and I think all of us here have had, that there are a lot of non-market forces determining what is going on. So, the same thing, you can't justify, you're talking about the wage at the bottom, you talk about the CEO pay, which has gone from being 30 times the average of the people who are working.
But why do CEOs get paid so much? They have a very difficult job, and the success or failure of a multi-billion-dollar corporation depends on them. So yeah, you want to attract the best talent you can for making critical decisions about the future of a massive company. That's just makes sense.
Working for them to over 300 times. Without any justification, you can't say they suddenly got more productive. Their productivity increased 10 times faster than the rest.
What did increase 10 times is the size of the business they're managing, and thus the impact of the decisions they make, even if their productivity remained the same.
Of society. So, and what's interesting, and it highlights the political nature, in Dodd-Frank in 2000.
Not to mention the size of other businesses which are willing to pay their salary. That's what wages are all about. Determining wages is the competition between other firms. So if there's only a few people of that skill set, and there's other organizations willing to pay them a lot of money to do what they do, then their wages are going to go up.
2010, there was included a provision that companies would have to disclose this number. And they've been fighting, the corporation's been fighting this disclosure. So we're 2015, 5 years after Dodd-Frank, and the SEC, who's supposed to write the regulations for the disclosure, is still hamstrung. So we got it through, and it got through Congress, got signed, and then the politics has made it impossible to actually get it.
And indeed, provisions of Dodd-Frank are being rolled back.
And then there are provisions that are being rolled back, like the one on the derivatives. And
I want to say a word about local action. So it's an interesting thing. As it turns out, there's a lot more scope for local increases in the minimum wage than you might have expected. I mean, there's actually the evidence we have is overwhelmingly economists who've studied what happens when New Jersey raises its minimum wage and Pennsylvania doesn't, and you would think there would have to be some loss of jobs, and we don't see it, which is telling you there's more room. On the other hand, it's
Here Kruger's referencing a famous employment study in 1992 called Kruger, where what they did was they called up a bunch of fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New Jersey increased their minimum wage from $4.20 to $5.05, and Pennsylvania did not increase their minimum wage. So it's like a natural control group. They're looking at businesses right on the border, and what they found was that there was no decrease in employment in these fast food restaurants that they called prior to or after the minimum wage. Employment actually increased slightly after the passing of the minimum wage increase. There's a lot of potential issues with this study. For example, they only looked at a small number of fast food restaurants. There's a lot of other businesses that hire employees at the minimum wage. And I'm not criticizing them for their methodology. Probably what they did was already a monumental task, and that's just the limit of scientific studies, is that you have to extrapolate from smaller samples, which is why you don't give too much credit to any particular study, but you look at the literature as a whole. Another issue is that I'm not sure that opponents of the minimum wage necessarily predict a large swell in firings at a fast food restaurant because of a modest increase in the minimum wage. There's a large cost associated with firing an employee and hiring a new one. So even if the worker was now slightly overpaid, for example, the employer estimates their productivity to be worth $4.70, and now they have to pay them $5. It might make more sense to keep them on at this slightly artificially high rate in hopes that their productivity increases, by another 6%, which it probably will, after a few months of working. As workers tend to increase their productivity, they get better at their jobs the more they work them. Rather than fire the employee and go on a job search, which can be expensive, and potentially hire a low productivity worker, because you're never certain when you hire somebody they're going to be the right worker. Especially fast food places are probably taking in a lot of uncertain workers that don't have much experience, teenagers, whatever. So I think there's a lot of reasons why this particular study is not conclusive. It's just one body of evidence amongst a sea of evidence. There's a lot of studies that demonstrate that the minimum wage does cause unemployment.
Be clear on that and everything else. That's a lot better if everybody does it at once. There is presumably some payoff to an individual state from undercutting the wages of every other state, and yet that's counterproductive for society as a whole. So local action is not a substitute for federal action. However, it can be a stepping stone, and I guess I still hope for political redemption. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big reader of the history of the New Deal, and the history of the New Deal actually begins a long ways before the New Deal. It begins with New Deal type programs at the state level. FDR didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of being governor of New York. He came out of Al Smith's New York. So that when we see these local initiatives that are spreading, they are good things in themselves, but they're also if you want the optimistic story about what America is like 20 years from now, I think a lot of it involves things that start at the level of states and cities trying to do better
I'm still trying to repeal the New Deal.
By their workers, trying to do better by ordinary families, and that eventually becomes the national norm.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I mean, that's the optimistic note. One of the striking things is when they do polls, about 70%.
That was the optimistic note, and
They do polls. 70% of Americans believe there ought to be an increase of the minimum wage.
The majority of Republicans believe we should do it.
And I think that's part of the, and I would love to get your thoughts on this. There are issues upon which the vast.
I'm not sure Bob from Nebraska is who we should be consulting about the minimum wage.
Americans agree, and our political system has proven incapable of moving the ball forward on any of them, and in some part because.
No, the minimum wage has been steadily increasing. It started at 30 cents.
Our legislative branch appears to be broken, in some part because moneyed interests have a very, very big stake in our political process. And I do you think that it will just get better, or there needs to be some kind of disruptive event to change the way we govern?
Oh, I think it's going to get worse unless there's a disruptive event. I mean, when you have things like the Citizens
I agree, but for different reasons.
United and
Right.
those court decisions are giving more power to money, and so unless there is what you call a disruptive event, I don't see any force pulling us back. And I say the one hopeful note are some issues, but a lot of them, some issues can be addressed at the local level, minimum wage. But you can't address the issue, for instance, of one of the mysteries. Why should people at the top pay lower tax rates than people who are not at the top? It's not a question of saying we're going to have a progressive tax that's going to take more from you. This is just saying you ought to pay at least the same rate. And so I think it's a really peculiar provision of our tax system.
Peculiar being.
I guess he's talking about like capital gains being taxed less than income. Of course, he's sort of vague booking about it. So the IRS says that most people pay about 15% on capital gains. But that's also money that was taxed originally when it was earned as income, however long ago that might have been.
Thank you for the mistake. Tomas, I want to ask you, we to the notion that economics is a social science.
And really, the capital gains is a bullshit tax because it's not like the wealth has increased. It's just that inflation has driven the number up. So the long-term result is just more money to the government, which I guess is the point of any tax. But just because the government's printing money doesn't mean you've actually increased your wealth. So when you sell it, it could have had the same value as when you bought whatever it was, the stock or the painting, and it just increased nominally in price, but you're still paying the difference.
We see a world
They really get you with inflation.
in upheaval, not just economically, but socially, politically, and culturally. And we've been talking a lot in the news media about terrorism and
Cultural upheaval?
the rise of ISIS, the rise of radicalized terrorists. And there are a number of factors that
What is cultural upheaval?
folks tend to point out as motivating factors in terms of radicalizing young men. Some of those factors are economic, that they feel disenfranchised, they're at the bottom, they feel hopeless. You have no sort of
I'm seriously wondering.
accuracy meter as far as whether that is actually the force. But when you hear about something like ISIS, or in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, and radical fundamental ideologies.
Charlie Hebdo, that was the guy who was painting those profane pictures of Muhammad, and he got, attacked or something? The building got attacked.
Attracting those sort of at the bottom of society.
I mean, talking about play stupid games, win stupid prizes, why would you go out of your way to purposely antagonize, unhinged jihadists who don't even need a reason to attack you in the first place?
How do you process that?
Well, it's clear that there are many different, cultural and social, economic forces that are playing a role. In the Middle East, the Middle East is probably the most unequal region in the world, even more unequal than Latin America, because if you take the distribution of oil resources, and in my book at some point I compare the total budget for education in a country like Egypt, which is a country with 90 million inhabitants, almost 100 million inhabitants, and their total education budget is 100 times smaller than the oil revenue that little countries with no inhabitant in the Gulf regions are getting out of their oil revenue just a few hundred kilometers away. And so that's a very unequal region, and the role that Western countries, European countries, and the US, of course, have.
Yeah, well, I mean, you stick a bunch of Jews in a country, it's going to be pretty goddamn prosperous. There's a reason they have, a quarter of the Nobel Prizes and 1% of the world's population. All right, these guys are smart.
To protect this extremely unequal situation, I think has not helped a lot to put it this way. I think we have contributed in a way to make this place, very place with a lot of tension. I'm not.
The fuck is this guy even talking about?
Saying that's the only reason, but
right.
that's certainly part of the problem. And in the case of Charlie Hebdo, the two young. Brothers, well, they were 30 years old when they went to Charlie Hebdo and killed everyone. When they were 20 years old, 10 years ago, they wanted and they actually tried to go to Iraq in order to fight the American army.
Blah, blah, blah.
But they tried, and now 10 years later, they're
mimes
trying to make war between Paris and Iraq, and it's so that's part of the of the story. I think the rise of nationalism and ethnic division is often a response to the failure to solve domestic social and inequality problems. And I'm very concerned also in Europe with the rise of nationalism, the rise of populism. In my country.
It's an interesting theory that the rise of nationalism is a response to a lack of domestic opportunities. We tend to scapegoat the other when things aren't going well. We see that in Canada, where the result of the Trudeau Liberals' disastrous economic and monetary policies has led to Canadians across the spectrum getting very hostile to the level of immigration and scapegoating the immigrants, when in reality it's their own progressive policies coming back to bite them in the butt. They just don't want to admit that that decades of interventionist and welfare state policies are finally sabotaging the wealth creation engine of the free market economy, which we barely even have anymore.
There is a serious risk that the extreme right will win not the national election, but possibly some regional elections at the end of this year. So I think when you cannot solve domestic social inequality problem in a peaceful manner, it's always tempting to blame others. To blame foreign workers, to blame foreign countries, foreign culture, foreign religion, and that's to me that's the biggest danger with rising inequality. Is that there can be more and more social groups who prefer to turn for nationalist solution or radical solution.
So, Professor Krugman, I would ask you in terms of the nationalism in the United States, right? That perhaps that's rooted in institutional failure or an inability for that the system is not working for a group of people. What's weird to me is the people that are most, the sort of entrenched opposition to government programs. Many of those people are the very same beneficiaries. Or the hatred for the Affordable Care Act. There are plenty of people in red states who would benefit.
Just because I'm poor doesn't mean I can't hate the welfare state, lady. All right, the whole. I'm not beholden to Marxist class struggle. I can think for myself.
Greatly by expanded exchanges.
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion in the sociological, political science literature. Boy, I'm sounding like a professor, aren't I? Anyway, but of the questions of false consciousness, and clearly in the U.S., a lot of it goes back to the original sin. It really is about race. And people don't, and it's not clear that the public in these states actually understands that they may themselves actually, it may not be taking from them to give to those people, but it might actually be for them. Actually, it's what's interesting about the case before the Supreme Court right now, that the ludicrous but possibly successful attempt to use a deliberate misreading of the act to deny the subsidies. The people who will be hurt would be overwhelmingly older Southern whites, because the minority groups are in by and large being covered by Medicaid, and of course in the northern states we have state exchanges for the most part. So this is the conservative base directing, carefully aiming a gun right at its own forehead.
With people trying to pull the trigger.
Right.
Or maybe some people care about more things than narrow self-interest and are concerned about having a free society and not seeing who can suckle the hardest at the government teat.
Desperately.
So it's but let me just say that there's a lot of people's motives are complicated, and and we may dislike them, and you might say, "Oh, look, that's stupid." But all right, people have complicated. pride, sense of identity matters a lot. I mean, some of the political scientists I talk to point out that there's a remarkable phenomenon of affluent people in the Northeast who vote for higher taxes on themselves. And they suggest, there's a famous Thomas Frank.
There are people in this room that probably do that.
There's a, I think my forthcoming job at CUNY is going to be largely about having dinner with us. Anyway, but someone said that Thomas Frank had a great, wonderfully written book called "What's the Matter with Kansas," and saying that you probably should also have a book "What's the Matter with Connecticut," because of all of these affluent people who vote for higher taxes on themselves. But look, it's I think a lot of it really is identity politics. That's what you really come down to. And I picked up a phrase from.
There's also a marked difference between individuals who earn their money in the market economy, supplying people with products they want to buy, than individuals who make their money through the sphere of the state. And that's certainly the case with these guys here, Krugman, Stigliz, and Piketty, whether or not they're directly employed by the government or they're part of hired by a university that receives massive amounts of government subsidies, both directly and then in the form of the student loan guarantees or student loan programs, rather. As much as they want to portray themselves as noble and self-sacrificing, really, when they're advocating for higher taxes on the rich, they're also advocating for more wealth to go back to the state, which employs them. So it's not quite as self-sacrificing as you might think, especially when you look at the trend as a whole.
When the Bernie Madoff scandal came, I learned a very useful phrase, which is affinity fraud, which is that people are very easily conned by other people who they think of as being like themselves, as being part of their tribe. And affinity fraud is just rampant in American politics.
Affinity fraud. I hope everyone's writing that down and going to tweet it and use it. That's a powerful concept.
Yeah. What I want to say is there are some aspects of inequality that are particularly enervating, destructive, and lead to say socially adverse behavior. One of them is when you have high levels of unemployment, particularly of youth, particularly of males, because if they can't use their energies productively, they tend to use them unproductively. And so the kinds of problems you're seeing in Europe, where in Greece there's this 60% youth unemployment rate, that's the kind of thing where it would not be surprised that you get explosive kinds of behavior. The second one is that there are a number of studies that show.
People talk about unemployment like it's this phenomenon that just happens, but why do they never say unemployment at what price? If you were to talk about steel that wasn't selling in the marketplace, the first question would be, well, what price are you trying to sell it at? The reality is there's no such thing as unemployment. Okay, that's a crazy statement, but hear me out here, okay? So there's two types of unemployment. First is voluntary unemployment. Say you're a executive at a company and you get fired. And you're looking for another job as an executive. You're paying $250,000 plus, good benefits, whatever. And it might take you 12 months, 16 months to find that job. And you're actively searching the whole time, and you're considered unemployed. But you're not really unemployed because you could be hired at another job at McDonald's for $8 an hour. So there's jobs available for you. You're just choosing not to work them. You're voluntarily unemployed. So that sort of unemployment isn't a problem, in my opinion, because they could work a job. They choose not to. That's obviously their decision, and probably the right one. But that's not society's problem. That's their problem, right? There's jobs available to them. They don't want to work them. They don't have to, but our role is just to make sure there are jobs available for people. So then there's the type of unemployment which might not even be measured, to when a person will work any job and they can't get one. And but that sort of unemployment, which is a real problem, because they're not going to have $1 million in the bank that they can wait out the job search. And that's the sort of unemployment that translates into what Stigliz is talking about here, societal problems like crime, terrorism, maybe just like domestic abuse. So that sort of unemployment is caused almost entirely by the minimum wage and potentially also like licensure restrictions, like a guy can't become a barber without a license or whatever. So to the degree that sort of unemployment exists, we'll get rid of the minimum wage. Eventually they'll find employment, okay, and maybe not a very high paying wage, and maybe you got to have welfare to back them up, if you want to look at it that way, but at least get rid of the minimum wage so they can work this low-paying job, gain skills, and be employed, even if it's at $5 or $6 an hour. So if you do that, there's no unemployment except the voluntary unemployment, which is somebody choosing not to work. Somebody chooses not to work, except for a specific wage in a specific industry. They're not really. That's not a problem,
So that when there's inequality that is ethnic based, when you have large groups of people who are poor of a particular group, so it's not across the board, it has an ethnic dimension, a racial dimension, that tends to be particularly destructive. And at least looking across countries, those countries where you have that kind of division are more likely to find themselves engaged in civil strife or one kind of dysfunctional behavior or another.
So that sort of gives rise to a bigger question here, which is, do you think more equal societies are happier societies? Because there are divergent studies about this, right? Income inequality seems like a bad thing, but unequal societies are not maybe necessarily happier societies. I guess I would like all three of your thoughts on that. Thomas, if you want to start.
It's a matter of degree. If you have a complete equality in poverty, you will not be very happy. So you probably need, China 30 years ago or 35 years ago was probably quite equal, but equal with, a lot of poverty that was not particularly good. So some level of inequality, can be necessary to put incentives on people, which sometimes just correspond to different life choices, sometimes correspond to pure incentives. So some level of inequality.
I don't see why inequality, or rather equality, is the goal that should be worked towards. Look, wealth doesn't just happen, it's created. So if an individual or an organization creates some wealth, I don't see why it's superior to have that wealth redistributed to people who played no part in its creation. I think what's important is justice. And what's just is that the people who create wealth are the people who have it.